Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She served as a consultant to the United States Environmental Protection Agency and was a consultant to the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And her books include Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, Why Trust Science, and Science on a Mission, How Military Funding Shaped What We Do and Don't Know About the Ocean. And she has an article at Common Dreams, Big Oil's Secret Strategy to Keep Winning. Welcome to Background Briefing, Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you, Ian. Nice to be back with you.
Well, thanks for joining us, Naomi. And your article at Common Dreams points out that climate delay is the new strategy to replace climate denial by the oil companies. And they recently, of course, the CEOs testified and they denied that they had anything to do with the delaying and obstructing science, the science about global warming. But at this point, it's a real problem and it's something of a dilemma for Joe Biden, isn't it? With inflation, at a 31-year high, he's trying to get the price of gas at the pump down, at the same time, essentially get rid of gasoline altogether and move as quickly as possible to an all-electric grid. So how do you think he's going to navigate this? Because at this point, he's asked the Federal Trade Commission to look into whether the oil companies are, in fact, engaged in illegal conduct.
Well, I have no idea what the president is going to do right now, although I can imagine some of his advisors are going back and looking at the Carter administration, because certainly he's in a very difficult situation. And we know that there has always been manipulation of prices in the energy industry. And we know that high gas prices can bring down a presidency. So he is facing a very serious issue at the very moment when we cannot afford to delay any longer on climate action. I like to remind people that we have known that climate change was real since 1988, when James Hansen first testified in the U.S. Congress that man-made climate change was underway. And for more than 30 years now, the fossil fuel industry has systematically worked to delay meaningful action. And we are now at a crisis point where not just a presidency is at stake, but our future is at stake, because we are just about out of time to do anything meaningful to stop the worst effects. And that's why this is such an urgent moment, and why I felt motivated with Jeff Nesbitt to write a piece that really just didn't pull any more punches, that really laid out clearly the long history of disinformation by this industry with a kind of reckless disregard to the consequences to you and me and everyone else.
So, but when you talk about Jimmy Carter's presidency being short-lived because of inflation and an oil crisis, and of course we all recall here in California you had to buy gas on, depending on whether your license plate had an odd or an even number, and people were lining up for gas and people were weeping. And then years later, of course, George W. Bush said that we're addicted to oil. Well, we are. It's pathetic. I mean, weeping over not being able to buy gasoline, I thought was the most powerful reminder of that. But yet, here you have George W. Bush from the oil patch of Texas saying we're addicted to oil, but it hasn't really changed, has it?
No, that's right. And part of the reason it hasn't changed is because the industry has done everything it possibly could to keep us addicted. We think about drug pushers pushing drugs. I can remember as a child being warned that pushers would give you free drugs in order to get you hooked. I don't know if they actually did that or not, but that's what we thought they did. And in a way, there's something sort of similar here where the industry pushes year after year, decade after decade for continued subsidies that keep fossil fuels cheap for the consumer, even though they're very expensive for the world. And so because we don't pay the true cost, we don't see how much fossil fuels really cost us when we fill up a tank of gas or pay our electricity bill, we keep operating as if they were cheap when in fact they're very, very expensive. Now, I don't want to be one of those academics who tells the president what to do. I know his job is very, very hard, but one thing I think he could do is this would be a perfect moment to say to the American people, now is the time to buy an electric car, because electric cars have become really terrific. There are many models on the market now. The industry has really stepped up to the plate in terms of offering. I mean, for goodness sake, you can get an electric Ford 150 now. So this would be a great moment to really push the electric vehicle market, to support Detroit and to support the American people, and to point out as well that, yes, there is a little bit more of an upfront cost to an electric car. That's true for most green energy, but you actually save money in the long run. It's not a message that people always are that happy to hear, but it's true. And, when I talk about, people often ask me, what do I do personally? And I always point out to people, well, when I put solar panels on my roof, there was an upfront cost associated with it, but now I have almost zero electricity bill every year.
And, of course, in the last, 9 months of this year, the largest oil and gas companies have made a combined $174 billion in profits, and that includes Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, etc.
So, and that's a great point, because another thing that he could do would be to impose a windfall profits tax on the industry and then use that money to give a rebate to the American people to cover any increase in the cost of oil and gas this year. So it's really important to remember the president and Congress have a lot of tools at their disposal, and there are lots and lots of ways to facilitate the energy transition while at the same time protecting consumers. And that's what I think the priority here needs to be.
And again, I'm speaking with Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. She served as a consultant to the United States Environmental Protection Agency and was a consultant to the United States Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And her books include Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, Why Trust Science, and Science on a Mission, How Military Funding Shaped What We Do and Don't Know About the Ocean. And she has an article at Common Dreams, Big Oil's Secret Strategy to Keep Winning. There's also something else that the president could do. And of course, oil, it's about, $70, $80 a barrel now, went up around 100, gone down a bit. But the U.S. was, up until recently, I think it probably still is, the number one producer of oil and gas in the world. And because the oil in the United States largely comes from fracking, which is an expensive process, the American oil companies prefer to sell it on the world market. But Biden could do something, from my understanding, is to basically force them to sell more on the domestic market and lower the price. And also you've got the factor of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's very much in the pocket of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, etc. There's a good chance, and I think it's pretty likely, that he's helping Trump in his comeback by refusing to ramp up production in Saudi Arabia, which they normally do to accommodate American presidents, particularly at election time. He did the same for Trump. So there's a couple of factors there. Let's start with the export market. Do you think that is there something that could be done?
Well, again, as I said before, the president and Congress have a lot of policy instruments at their disposal. There's often been a lot of resistance in Congress to the president trying to control domestic energy markets for a lot of different reasons. And probably in the long run, it's probably not a great idea. But in the short run, as an emergency measure, absolutely, he certainly could do that. The Saudis, again, I'm not an expert on the Saudis, but we certainly have seen over the decades that often the Saudis have increased oil exports to help the United States by keeping the price of oil down. And the fact that they're not doing that now is obviously political. So this all gets back to the central question of political power. We have plenty of energy. The United States has the capacity to meet most of its energy needs with renewable energy, with upgrades to our transmission lines. We know what we need to do. The science is very, very clear. The technology exists, but what stands in the way is the political and economic power of entrenched interests, of whom the fossil fuel industry is the most important of those entrenched interests. And that's what we really have to discuss. And until we can really get that front and center and figures out a way to break the political lock that these people have on our lives, I think we will be continuing to have this conversation over and over and over again.
Well, I think we need to know that, don't we? The extent to which this is a political act on the part of big oil. If you go back to Jimmy Carter and the inflation that brought him down, as a one-term president, and the fear that the same could happen with Joe Biden. He's not getting a lot of help from his own senators like Manchin and Sinema and some of a handful in the House. I mean, is there a pattern here that if you take on big oil, and Biden has, and he's obviously got an ambitious agenda in terms of trying to electrify the grid and get these stimulus packages to invest in electric cars that you mentioned, which, you know, the market seems to be responding to. I'm just curious to know whether is there some investigative journalism going on here that would indicate that your article mentions Ida Tarbell and how she brought down Standard Oil, but of course the irony was that the Rockefellers ended up making more money out of being broken up than they would had they maintained the consolidated control. So give me a sense of whether you think there's some investigative journalism here required if we are to see a repeat of what happened to Jimmy Carter.
Well, I definitely think there's some investigations that are needed, both in terms of journalists and also in terms of the federal regulatory agencies. I mean, many of our regulatory agencies have been weakened, loath to really take on tough questions. Some of them are clearly captured. So we also need to find ways to re-empower our regulatory structures. That's not going to happen overnight, though, and that's part of the difficulty, is that we're stuck in this very difficult spot. But I think that anyone who does have information on this needs to talk to journalists. I mean, certainly what's going on right now smells pretty fishy, right? All of a sudden, the price of oil and gas is going up again, and all of a sudden we're having these, threats of shortages right at the moment when it seemed like the world was really prepared to do something about climate change. And we've seen that before, of course. This isn't the first time that just when it seemed that we were about to get action on climate change, something happened to give people cold feet. And then, the whole issue of Joe Manchin is such a difficult one. I understand that he represents West Virginia, and I understand that he wants to be reelected in West Virginia, but he also has a massive conflict of interest because of his relationships with the coal industry. And, there's been a reluctance to call that out. I mean, some journalists have. But, the Democratic Party needs to find a way to clean up its act, because it isn't just Joe Manchin. I mean, for 20 years, there were many Democrats in Congress who were very reluctant to have meaningful action on climate change because they had oil, gas, or coal interests in their state. We've seen that from Colorado. We've seen it in the past from other states as well. So, this is a tough time, and it's one of those moments when people really have to stand up and be counted. And that's what I hope will happen. And that's what I hope our article will help with, to remind people that the fossil fuel industry is not the friend of the American people. We saw in the hearings a couple of weeks ago, the fossil fuel industry tried to present themselves in a framework that my research associate Jeffrey Supran and I have called the fossil fuel savior, that they're just a great set of companies giving us the energy we need, fighting energy poverty, working on innovative technologies like algae biofuel. But if you actually look at what they are doing, all of their actions are engaged in preventing meaningful action on climate change and keeping us dependent on fossil fuels, and not just this year, but for the foreseeable future. All of the companies who testified in Congress, with the sole exception of Shell, said that they intend to continue to explore for more oil and gas, to develop more oil and gas fields. They are all involved in the development of more fossil fuel infrastructure. And this means being committed not to just fossil fuels for a few more years while we transition into renewable energy, but for the next 30, 50, even 75 years. It means blocking the transition. And this is really the essential piece that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. The fossil fuel industry is not working in collaboration with Congress to figure out how we transition to renewable energy. They're working to block that transition.
And as your article points out, climate delay is the new climate denial. But the race then surely is between the awakening of the people in this country about the consequences of global warming, which are pretty manifest, and we've just seen this in the last few days in the Midwest, and particularly in Kentucky, where the worst tornado in history have ripped through the Midwest, and it's still happening. So, meanwhile, you've got these record profits from the oil companies, $170 $4 billion in the last 9 months. They're doing $8 billion worth of stock buybacks. So those are the realities. So do you think at some point or other, citizens and affected companies like insurance companies can be a counter lobby to this mendacity of the oil companies pretending to care about global warming and renaming methane as a natural gas as though somehow it's nature friendly?
Yeah. Right. Well, lots of things are natural. Arsenic is natural. Oil and gas are natural. So the fact that something is natural is not necessarily good. There are good things in nature and there are bad things in nature. But I think your point is the crucial one, that there are many people, organizations, and industries in this country who could really form an effective coalition to change the political dynamics. And frankly, they haven't really stepped up to the plate. And the insurance industry is an obvious one. People have been talking about insurance and reinsurance for more than a decade now. The insurance company obviously knows what's going on. They are paying the price of all of this additional damage. Mostly they pass that price on to the consumer, but the reinsurance industry is very, very well aware of this. Why they won't speak up more in public, I don't know. Maybe you can get someone from the reinsurance industry to come on board. We're starting to see the financial sector stepping up to the plate more, but certainly banks, finance, there's a huge community in the private sector that has a strong interest in fixing this problem. But, we don't hear from them, or I shouldn't say we, Congress doesn't hear from them nearly as much as it hears from the fossil fuel industry and its allies. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island one time told me that every time there is any kind of climate legislation that starts to get serious on the Hill, the halls of Congress are filled with the fossil fuel industry lobbyists, but they're not filled with nobody from Microsoft or Apple or, I don't know, even Ford Motor Company. They're not there creating a counter narrative about how fixing the climate crisis can be good for the American economy, good for American jobs. And so, we really, if I could do anything in the world, ask business leaders to step up to the plate and say the fossil fuel industry does not represent the interests of American business. They represent the interest of the fossil fuel industry.
And it's not just gas and oil, it's plastics. And look what's happening with plastics. A big chunk of the middle of the Pacific is just a vast garbage dump of plastic. It's manifesting itself in all kinds of ways. So I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She served as a consultant to the United States Environmental Protection Agency and was a consultant to the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. Her books include Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscure the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, Why Trust Science, and Science on a Mission, How Military Funding Shaped What We Do and Don't Know About the Ocean. And she has an article at Common Dreams, Big Oil's Secret Strategy to Keep Winning. We're going to take a big station break and back looking into next week's elections for president in Chile, where the front